今、おはようございます。私はソウル大学のリー・ヒャンボク教授です。Well, how long do you want me to continue in Japanese? I don't think none of you really expects me to go on in Japanese because I'm 下手ですから。Thank you very much for a nice introduction this morning. And I am really greatly honored to be here on this stage this morning for a short, I hope, a short paper presentation. To begin with, the title on Blackboard is not quite, right, I would say. That was the title I meant to speak on about 3 months ago when I was asked to deliver a speech here. And then I've been not feeling well, so I couldn't quite finalize my paper on this topic. So instead, I'll talk about, you might have one-page brochure, one-page resume of my paper already. And as you can see from this topic I'm going to talk on, has been a linguistic phonetic approach to speech, or speech education, if you like. It's more fundamental topic, I think, than rhythmic problem. It's also very important for the English learners, especially for Japanese. The English phonetician, Daniel Jones, he mentioned this. The rhythmic problem is one of the foremost and most difficult things for Japanese learners of English. He said that in his outline of English phonetics. When was that? I think before the war already, for the Second World War. I'll touch briefly on this topic, the rhythm, during my talk this morning, but the本格的なpaper will be reserved for another occasion. Well, I'll read through my paper and just elaborate here and there whenever I need add further examples and so on. Henry Sweet. I hope you all know the name of this gentleman, Henry Sweet. The great English phonetician and linguist, and the undisputed founder of modern phonetics, said in his book, The Sounds of English, 1908, that phonetics alone can breathe life into the dead mass of letters. Breathe life into the dead mass of letters. Right, what does that mean? Which constitute the written language. The mass of letters which constitute the written language. It alone can bring the rustic dialogues of novels before every intelligent reader as living realities. A knowledge of sentence stress and intonation is not only an essential part of elocution and correct pronunciation, it is also an integral part of the syntax of many languages. Taken fully. No doubt, Henry Sweet here stresses not only the importance of the spoken language. Spoken language is an essential sort of thing for linguistic analysts, especially phoneticians, not written language. The linguists in Korea, in Japan, and in many other countries have been struggling to analyze language using written language. some, it doesn't do any good, especially for spoken language education. Not only the importance of the spoken language as such, but also the important role linguistic phonetics can play in speech, language teaching, and speech science, etc. It goes without saying that a basic knowledge of linguistic phonetics is essential not only for phoneticians, linguists, language teachers, in the humanities subject, but also for speech scientists in the fields of science and technology. In particular, some knowledge of and training in linguistic phonetics will provide an indispensable foundation for those engaged in speech synthesis and recognition, a very popular topic nowadays throughout the world. For instance, how could a speech scientist dealing with the Korean speech synthesis and recognition ever hope to carry out his task successfully without acquiring adequate knowledge of Korean phonetics? That is to say, vowels, consonants, prosodic features, speech rhythms, and intonation, which can be made available by professional phoneticians and linguists. Unfortunately, I have personally come across not a few papers and presentations made by language teachers and speech scientists almost everywhere, in many countries in the world, in which elementary errors and mistakes have been revealed, apparently due to the lack of phonetic fundamentals. I'd like to discuss some instances of what I would like to call unphonetic approaches, or unphonetical, or non-phonetical approaches to speech adopted by some unphonetic teachers and researchers, mainly in Korea. But I'm fairly certain that similar kinds of symptoms will be observed here in this country, Japan. First of all, many people confuse monophthongs with diphthongs. Nonsensical mistakes, I would say, for those who have a little knowledge of phonetics. Now, in Korean, there's a so-called simple vowel first letter is Korean alphabet. And in bracket you have the IPA symbol U. The secondary cardinal vowel number 2, U. Right? Now it used to be pronounced as U in Korea, in the past at least. And President Kim Dae-jung, the Korean president, current president, is from southwestern part of Korea. And in that dialect, this monophthong still lives on. And whenever you listen to President Kim Dae-jung's speech, you recognize this vowel. But it's not heard. It's not used in standard Seoul speech nowadays. It's regularly sort of realized as W-E, way, diphthong, way. It's regularly and usually realized as a diphthong way in the standard speech of Seoul. And yet, many speech scientists as a simple vowel in the research, mainly because they're simply used to the old literature on the topic. Old literature on the topic. And they are usually incompetent to make phonetic judgment themselves. Without phonetic training, how do they, really distinguish this ö and ue? If they maintain this argument and synthesize this vowel, as a monophone, the result would definitely sound dialectic. What a waste of time and energy, you can imagine, if they have to go back to the beginning and start all over again in language teaching and speech technology. And this is really a lamentable sort of situation. It dies very hard. Now, there's another problem is misinterpretation of the Korean diphthong wa. With an additional dot. This gives us the diphthong wa in Korean. And many Korean scholars and speech technologists have erroneous view of the diphthongal monosyllable wa, this wa, W-A. They have a tendency and temptation to analyze it as a sequence of two simple vowels, or plus R. So that is forming two syllables instead of one. Wa instead of wa. But there's a big difference phonetically, of course. Nothing could be further away from the phonetic reality. Apparently, they are misled by the graphemic structure of the Korean syllable wa. You see, in Korean alphabet, Korean graphemic structure, this is analyzed. O followed by A. So this is a good piece of evidence of what I would call spelling phonetics. This sort of misunderstanding is sometimes seen even in the romanization of Korean. In an old romanization, we have romanization. Right? And we have very complicated picture of romanization in Korean because we have more sounds in Japanese, more vowels and so on. And the Roman alphabet, 26 letters, isn't enough for our purpose. So there are more, I would think, over 20 or 30 different romanization systems of Korean competing each other. So in romanizing Korean, people of this sort maintain that why don't we represent, say, wa as an O plus A. You see, the sentimentality is following that. Next one is concerned with the failure to distinguish Korean E and A vocabulary problem. E and A. This is a very difficult point for Japanese learning English and Korean. Because we don't have the Japanese E and A distinction. You simply go to the E and A. No. youngsters also experience this kind of difficulty, whereas the people over 40 or 50, they do distinguish these correctly. So in the eyes of some Koreans, the half-closed air, similar to cardinal vowel number 2A, and half-open air, are distinguished only visually, say by a writing system. The top ones, close air, and the bottom one, air, open air. Only visually. When they look at this spelling, they know what is meant. But they don't actually hear, they don't really perceive the difference, or neither would they pronounce them distinctly. Consequently, they're bound to pronounce the two vowels one and the same, just like Japanese. Somewhere here, air. So serious is the situation that a mobile phone company, a mobile phone model, has been erroneously named Anico. The correct version would be Anico. English word any, anybody, any language, any, right? But this is the leading Korean company. You would know the name if I name it. Samsung. Samsung has this model, you see. Any call. They written down, they wrote in Hangul, Korean word any. Open vowel, a. So they led people to pronounce this Anico. As if it meant Annie, a girl's name perhaps. Anico. Nonsense. Now next comes confusion of central vowel, the so-called central vowel, schwa, with back vowels. Centralized vowel, is usually pronounced long in Korean, and also very often perceived and pronounced by the majority of Koreans as a back unrounded vowel. Of the secondary cardinal 6 of, as in money, mother, has two vowels, first and second syllable, money. If you pronounce this word using schwa, it will sound emeni. Emeni, that's sensual. The Koreans normally say money. Well, this is a result of confusion between sensual and that vowel. This habit is usually mainly naturally introduced into the English pronunciation. So Koreans would say turn around, you turn, as turn, and you turn around. Right? And the problem is, they think the pronunciation is right, close to the stem. But in fact, what they are doing is quite wrong to the eyes, to the ears of phoneticians. Now next comes the question of failure to perceive homogenic, plosive consonants, plosive clusters, that is. There are phonological and morphological contrasts between a single and double plosives in Korean, as in akida and akida. The bottom one has two K's, cluster, K cluster. Which akida means this is a musical instrument, right? This is a musical instrument. And the top one, akida, is to cherish someone, to treasure someone. So the meanings are totally different, depending on whether you use one K or two Ks. But nowadays, many Koreans, they don't really make distinction between this K and double K. And they both pronounce these as akida. And I can't really understand them, whether they mean this is an instrument, or to endear or to cherish something. You do have in Japanese the clusters, you know, so this might give you some chance to think about. Another famous example is the confusion of fricative and affricate. Fricative and affricate. Fricative Z. Fricative Z is regularly perceived and pronounced by Koreans as an affricate. J. My old friend and colleague, Professor John Wells, talked about it yesterday in his special seminar or workshop, was it? So the English word like zoo, dobuzen, zoo to Jewish no Jew, Israeli no Jew. Just this one. And that is the dobuzen no zoo. Dobuzen no zoo is almost always pronounced as Jew by Koreans. There's no distinction maintained between zoo and Jew. So, 動物はみんなJewになりますね。風は鍛冶屋になります。If they had some practical training, somebody at the opening ceremony talked about, he mentioned something very important. 英語の音声教育、音声学じゃなくてね、音声学を利用して教育をする、発音の教育。それが it's very important. Phonetic theory alone doesn't get you far. It doesn't do as much in learning correct pronunciation or teaching good pronunciation. Theory is theory, and practical training is quite another. That's my conviction after nearly 40 years of my teaching at Seoul University and elsewhere. Theory itself is quite useless when you come to the question of correct pronunciation teaching and learning. Another interesting thing is confusion of alveolar affricate, TS. So, affricate TS and palatalveolar affricate. Sure. and TS affricate is regularly replaced by palato-alveolar affricate in the speech and hearing of most Koreans. So the word sports is pronounced by Koreans as what? Sportchu. Even the newspaper title, the sports daily title has the sportchu in Korean. In this matter, in this respect, Japanese is very lucky. You have TS in there. So no need to worry about this problem. It's reserved only for Koreans. Now, I told this story in other seminars before in Japan. The difficulty faced by Japanese in learning English vowels. You see, 3 years ago, I landed at Nagoya Airport to give a special lecture at one of the EPSJ conferences. And I was asked by at the airport, by an officer, a lady officer, what door is your papasu? What door is your papasu? I couldn't understand that, you see. For God's sake, So I said, beg your pardon. And she, good-looking lady officer, repeated exactly the same. What door is your papasu? Now, on that, I could guess the 3/4 of what she said, the initial part, but not the last word. Papasu. You, Dr. Wells, tell me. I think I know. Maybe a phonetician like you. So I looked into the sky, and then, looked at her again, searching in my memory, in my mind, whatever, she could have said. And it was only after she repeated 4 or 5 times that I knew she meant purpose. So what is your purpose? It was pronounced by her as, what door is your papasu? This papasu was evaded. A few errors, you see, in that pronunciation. First of all, the stress was not on the first syllable, purpose, but papasu. The equals, it's a rhythmic problem, Japanese have. The equal sort of, the syllable times rhythm, papasu, dun dun dun, not purpose, but dun dun dun. There was an extra syllable, the purpose is 2 syllable pause in English, which is pronounced with 3 syllables, papasu. And furthermore, vowel sound was different, not purpose, but papasu. I mean, all this combined misled me. And for God's sake, I was very, it was an embarrassing situation. So I said finally, oh yes, I got it now. I'm going to give a talk at EPSJ conference. What is EPSJ? So I have to elaborate again. Now next comes short vowel in CVC syllable. CBC students. Is perceived as long by many Koreans, including school teachers and technologists. For instance, the mal these words, mal and mal, long vowel, mal. This word means speech, language, and mal, short vowel, would mean running horse, animal. The youngsters nowadays, in Korea, they shorten this vowel, long vowel, very short. So these two words are not distinguished properly in their speech. And strangely, they pronounce mal very short, with the vowel pronounced very short, and still think they are lengthening the vowel, you see, in their mind. Their pronunciation is apparently, mal, short vowel. But they think somehow they pronounced it wrong. And this is a very funny sort of, situation. What they exactly do is shortening the vowel, but instead they lengthen the final consonant L. So it becomes mal, long L, but short vowel. But somehow they still think the vowel is long. Right? And this comes into picture in the English pronunciation too. Next item concerns intonation tunes. There are as much misunderstanding in the perception and pronunciation of intonational tunes as in segmental sounds, vowels and consonants. For instance, high falling tone, as in yes in English, or hadayo, yo, high fall, is very often perceived as a high rising tone, like that is, yes is perceived as yes, hadayo is perceived as hadayo. Well, similarly, forward rise fall, rise fall. Rise fall tune is often heard as forward rise, quite the opposite. So, is taken as forward rise. Now next comes the long-awaited, the speech-written question. Perceptual and articulatory difficulties pertaining to speech rhythm are often observed in many Korean speakers. For instance, sadari. That's the standard rhythmic pattern of Korean sadari, meaning ladder, climbing ladder. Second syllable is stressed and also pronounced long. But many Koreans, especially youngsters, pronounce it as sadai, with a stress on the first one. This kind of prosodic difficulty is not limited only to Koreans. It's interesting to note in passing that the rhythmic patterns of Japanese names like Nagamura and Fujisaki. Fujisaki is a former Todai professor and good friend of mine. And whenever we have international conference, he presents a paper and is introduced as Professor Fujisaki. Fujisaki. The stress is Hugh and Sa, or Fujisaki, are Westerners, English speakers. But to my ears, in Japanese, we have only one, Fujisaki, and the second syllable, Chi. Nakamura no onaji desu ne. Nakamura, and Nakamura, Nakamura. So this is a sort of universal feature, one way or another. We make mistakes here and there. The perceptual and articulatory difficulties and misunderstanding discussed above under 10 headings are some of the most common phonetic errors committed by a majority of Koreans, including speech technologists. There is no hard and fast rule that one can apply to these problems to solve these problems. Each of the phonetic problems, either perceptual or articulatory, has to be dealt with individually and separately. In other words, each of them has to be learned one by one. And I'm confident that anyone wishing to overcome this kind of phonetic difficulties can do so. And do so by what? Acquiring basic knowledge of traditional articulatory phonetics and getting an adequate amount of systematic training in perception and articulation. This is something the London School of Phonetics is well known for. They're doing it in postgraduate courses. I did this myself when I was doing my postgraduate work in London in the Phonetics department with Dr. John Wells. A few times a week, sometimes, with other colleagues in the class, and sometimes individually. Each day, usually, dictation. And without this, I'm trying to introduce, I've been trying to do this in my classes in Seoul University myself. And the more you do, the more critical results you are sure to get. I have a few more pages to go, but I'll skip here and just mention one short item on intonation and rhythm. There are some linguistic phoneticians nowadays, permanent role, especially in the United States, who seem to try to abstract and formulate intonational tunes without taking into account the question of speech rhythm. In other words, separate speech rhythm from intonation. Is it really feasible, I wonder, or worthwhile to analyze intonation without paying attention to the rhythmic pattern of the sentence on which intonation is to be realized? Personally, it seems to me to be unrealistic just to pursue intonational analysis independently of the role of speech rhythm for the following reasons. One, if the role of speech rhythm is left out of intonational analysis, it will sometimes be extremely difficult to break up long intonational tunes into smaller tonal units, especially when the sentence or utterance consists of more than one stress group or rhythmic unit. Two, it will be impossible to locate and pinpoint the nucleus of the intonational tune in case the utterance consists of several rhythmic units. Three, there will be no systematic way to deal with the tonal behavior of the parts of the sentence that precedes and that follows the nucleus. Let me illustrate the point by a short, well, I've given here Korean sentences, but let me try to illustrate this point using an English, short English speech material. Say, it is beautifully done. Let's take an example, but it is beautifully done. Now, if you trace this roughly, the tonal, the configuration, it is rather low and unstressed. It's beautifully done. Now, there's a stress here, another here. Nucleus is normally, we take this as nucleus of the sentence. It is beautifully done. If we leave out the question of rhythm, from this tonal pattern, then you just get this sort of the melody line configuration. And what would you describe this? It's kind of rise-fall tune, isn't it? It's rise-fall. But the able phoneticians don't treat this as a rise-fall intonation at all, tune in English. Because they think of the role of rhythmic pattern and the stress, the place where stress falls, etc. So they take this as nucleus, head, and unstressed, sort of pre-head, and so on. So, neglecting, avoiding the role of rhythmic rhythms here, for instance, just tracing the tonal configuration, you can end up getting rise-fall tune. But it's not rise-fall tune, as I said. So I'm rather worried about this sort of, approach to prosodic, especially intonational analysis. Right, let me just summarize. I believe the point illustrated just now is an eloquent testimony to the close-knit nature of speech rhythm and intonation in speech. I'm fairly certain that most of the unphonetic approaches to speech and language that I have illustrated so far may be seen in any language community, say in Japan, Japanese, English, or French. And I think this is an area where phonetics has a definite and significant role to play, and also in our teaching and learning methodology. Well, that's all I have to say this morning. Thank you very much for listening.